spiritual ground of education. First, I ask you to forgive me for being unable to speak to you in the language of this country, and because I am unpracticed, I must form things in the language I am able to use. Any problems this causes will, I trust, be rectified in the translation that follows. Second, allow me to say that I feel especially grateful to the distinguished committee that made it possible for me to hold these lectures here at Oxford. It is a special honor to be able to lecture in this venerable town, where I experienced the grandeur of ancient tradition 20 years ago. Now I am about to speak of a method of education that may, in a sense, be called new. These days I would say that there are many who seek novelty simply for the sake of novelty. However, before anyone strives for something new in any area of human culture, one must first learn to respect what is old. Here in Oxford I feel the power that lives in these old traditions and how it inspires. One who can feel this may also have the right to speak of what is new. In order to maintain itself, anything new must be rooted in the venerable past. It may be the failure and tragedy of our time that there is a constant demand for various new things, while so few are inclined to create the new from the old. Consequently, I am deeply grateful, in particular to Mrs. Mackenzie, the organizer of this conference, and to the whole committee that arranged these lectures. I feel deep gratitude because this makes it possible to express something new in this environment of revered antiquity, which alone can sponsor it. I am equally grateful for the very kind words of introduction that Principal Jacks spoke here yesterday. I have already indicated, perhaps, the point of view from which these lectures will be given. What I have to say about education and teaching is based on the spiritual scientific knowledge that has been my life's work. Initially, this spiritual science was cultivated for its own sake, and in recent years friends have come forward to carry it into particular domains of practical life as well. Thus, it was Emil Molt of Stuttgart who, being aware of the work in spiritual science at the Goetheanum, wanted to see it applied to the education of children in a school. This led to the Waldorf School in Stuttgart. The educational principles of this school are based on a spiritual life that leads necessarily to a renewed education and conforms with the spirit of our age, a renewal demanded by the tasks of human development during the present epoch. This education and curriculum is based entirely on knowledge of the human being. This knowledge spans our whole being from birth to death. It aims to know all the supra-sensory aspects of the human being between birth and death, everything that demonstrates the human place in a supra-sensory world. In our age, we have many kinds of spiritual life, but above all we have a spiritual life inherited from ancient times and handed down by tradition. Along with this spiritual life, and having less and less contact with it, there is the life that flows to us from the magnificent discoveries of modern natural science. In an age that includes the lives of the leading spirits of natural science, when speaking of spiritual life, we cannot ignore the potent contributions of natural science to knowledge of the human being. Natural science can indeed help us understand the bodily nature and functions of the human being during physical life. It has not, however, succeeded in reaching the essential spirit of the human being, because it experiments with external tools and observes with the outer senses. I do not mean this as a criticism. It was the great service of natural science, as systematized by people like Huxley, for example, that it looked at nature with complete disregard of anything spiritual in the world. Nevertheless, the knowledge of the human being, derived from psychology and anthropology, cannot help us understand anything spiritual. In our modern civilization, we have a spiritual life, and the various religious denominations maintain and spread this life of the Spirit. However, that spiritual culture is incapable of answering the essential questions about eternity and immortality, or about the suprasensory life to which we belong. It does not give us confidence when our isolation in worldly life causes us to wonder about the true nature of the eternal suprasensory reality behind the world of the senses. We may have beliefs about our existence in the womb of divine suprasensory worlds before we were born. We may form beliefs about what our souls will go through after passing through the portal of death. And we may formulate such beliefs into a creed that warms our hearts and cheers our spirits. We can tell ourselves that within the universe as a whole we are greater beings than we are in this physical life between birth and death. But what we gain is still a belief, something we think and feel. It is becoming increasingly difficult to put into practice the great discoveries and principles of natural science while holding on to such spiritual beliefs. Whereas we know of the Spirit, we no longer understand how to utilize Spirit or do anything with it, nor do we know how to permeate our work and daily life with Spirit. And what is the primary area of life in which we must come to terms with Spirit? It is education. Here we must comprehend the whole human being, which is body, soul, and spirit. We must be able to work with Spirit when we teach. In every era, people have had to take Spirit into consideration and work through its power. Now, because we have made such advances in the physical sciences, this call to work with Spirit is even more urgent. Consequently, today's social issue is primarily one of education. Today we may ask ourselves, justifiably, what we can do that will make our society and social institutions less tragic and menacing. We have only one answer. Those who have been educated through the creative activity of Spirit must be given positions in the practical life of the community. The sort of knowledge we are speaking of assumes that we continue to deal with life. It looks for the Spirit within life and makes this the basis of education through the stages of life. In children, Spirit is closer to the body than in adults, and we see in children how physical nature is shaped by Spirit. What exactly is a child's brain at the time of birth, according to modern natural science? It is like a sculptor's clay, ready for shaping. Now look at the brain of a 7-year-old at the beginning of elementary school. It has become a wonderful work of art, but one that will need more work right up to the end of schooling. Hidden spiritual forces work to mold the human body, and as educators we are called on to contribute to this work. We are called to do more than observe bodily nature. Whereas we must never neglect the body, we are asked to observe the way it is at work in bodily nature. Observe the way Spirit is at work in bodily nature. We are called to work with the unconscious Spirit, to link ourselves not only with the natural, but with the divine order of the world. When we confront education earnestly, we must do more than acknowledge God for the peace of our souls. We must also will God's will and act on the intentions of God. This, however, requires a spiritual basis in education. It is this that I will speak to you about in the following days. When we observe children, we must feel how necessary it is to have spiritual understanding and vision before we can adequately follow what takes place in them each day, what takes place in the soul and spirit. We should consider how the very youngest children are completely different in later childhood, let alone adulthood. We should bear in mind the great amount of sleep children need in their early days of life. We must wonder what takes place in that interchange between spirit and body when a baby spends nearly 22 hours asleep. Today, in both philosophy and practical life, it is thought that one can no more see into the soul of a child than one can see into the soul of an animal or plant. Here we encounter the limit of human knowledge. The spiritual view that we represent here does not say that these are the limits of human knowledge or human cognition. Rather, we must bring forth from the depths of human nature the forces of cognition that can observe the complete human being of body, soul, and spirit, just as a physiologist can observe the structure of the human eye or ear. If, until now, we lack such knowledge because of our natural scientific education, we must begin to build it up. Consequently, I will speak to you about how to develop a kind of knowledge that assures genuine insight into the inner texture of childhood life. Devoted, unprejudiced observation of life goes a long way in bringing about such understanding. If we look at a child and see only the outer, we cannot find any specific points of development between birth and about the 20th year. We see everything only as a continuous development. But this is not true of one who observes childhood through the knowledge I will speak of during the next few days. In this case, children up to the 7th or 8th year, when the change of teeth begins, are fundamentally different from what they are later on, after the change of teeth until about the 14th year, or puberty. We are confronted by very significant questions when we try to sink deep into a child's life. How do soul and spirit work on children up to the change of teeth? How do soul and spirit work on children when we have to educate them at the elementary school level? How should we cooperate with soul and spirit? We see, for example, that speech develops instinctively during the first period of life, up to the change of teeth. Instinctively, as far as children are concerned and regarding their surroundings. We devote a good deal of thought today to the question of how children learn to speak. I will not go into the historical origin of speech today. But how do children actually learn to speak? Do they have some sort of instinct whereby they lay claim to the sounds they hear? Or do they derive the impulse for speech from some other connection with their environment? If we look more deeply into childhood life, we can see that children learn to speak by imitating what they observe unconsciously in their surroundings using the senses. The whole life of children, up to the 7th year, is a continuous imitation of events in their environment. And the moment they perceive something, whether a movement or a sound, an impulse arises as an inner gesture to relive, with the intensity of their whole inner nature, what has been perceived. We can understand children only when we contemplate them, as we would the eye or ear of an older person, because the whole being of a child is a sense organ. Blood pulses through a child's body in a far livelier way than it does later on in life. By means of a fine physiology, we can perceive the basis for the development of our sense organs, the eye, for example. During the very early years, blood assumes primacy in the process of the eye's development. Later, the nerves begin to predominate more and more. The structure of the human senses develops from blood circulation to nerve activity. It is possible to acquire a delicate faculty for perceiving how the blood system gradually leads into the nervous system. As with a single sense organ, say the eye, so goes the whole human being. Children need a great deal of sleep because they are like a whole sense organ. They would otherwise be unable to endure the dazzle and noise of the outer world. Just as the eye must close to the dazzling sunlight, likewise this sense organ, the child, must shut itself off against the world. Because children are like an entire sense organ, they must sleep a great deal. Whenever children are confronted with the world, they have to observe and converse inwardly. Every sound of speech arises from an inner gesture. Footnote: for a more extensive discussion of his ideas on language, see Rudolf Steiner, The Genius of Language, Observations for Teachers, which I believe is on this website. End of footnote. Let me say that what I am saying here out of spiritual knowledge is open to scientific demonstration today. There is a scientific discovery, and please forgive the personal allusion, but this discovery has dogged me all my life. It is just as old as I am, having been made the year I was born. This discovery has to do with the fact that human speech depends on the left parietal convolution of the brain. It is formed in the brain. This whole development takes place, however, during childhood by means of the formative forces I have spoken of. And if we contemplate the whole connection between the gestures of the right arm and the right hand, which usually dominate in children, we can see how speech is formed out of gesture through imitation of the environment, using an inner, secret connection between blood, nerves, and brain convolutions. Later I will speak of left-handed children and their relation to the majority. They are exceptional, but they prove very well how the building forces of speech are connected with every gesture of the right arm and hand, right down to smallest details. If we had a more subtle physiology than is usual today, we would be able to discover not only the passive, but the active principle for each phase of life. The active principle is especially alive in the child as a great organ of sense. Thus children live in their environment in the same way that, in later years, one's eye lives in its environment. EYE. The eye is formed from the general organization of the head. It lies in a separate cavity so that it can participate in the life of the outer world. Likewise, children participate in the life of the outer world. They live entirely within the external world and do not yet sense themselves. Today, the kind of knowledge we develop is called intellectual knowledge, and it is entirely within us. It is the form of knowledge appropriate to our civilization. We believe we comprehend the outer world, but the thoughts and logic to which we limit knowledge dwell within us. Children, on the other hand, live entirely outside themselves. Do we have the right to claim that our intellectual mode of knowledge ever allows us to participate in a child's experience of the outer world, this child who is all sense organ? We cannot do this. We can only hope to achieve this through a kind of cognition that goes beyond itself, one that can enter the nature of all that lives and moves. Intuitional cognition is the only knowledge that can do this, not intellectual knowledge, which leaves us within ourselves. That knowledge causes us to question every idea in terms of its logic. We need a knowledge that allows spirit to penetrate the depths of life itself, intuitional knowledge. We must consciously acquire intuitional knowledge. Only then can we become practical enough to do what we must in relation to spirit in children during their earliest years. Footnote: Steiner uses the words imagination, inspiration, and intuition in very specific ways to describe levels of initiation or spiritual capacities. Therefore, to distinguish his use of these words from their more common meanings, they are italicized in this volume. For clear descriptions of Steiner's use of these terms, see title Stages of Higher Knowledge. And I'll mention again that is in the written works, I believe. Well, I'm not even sure now, but I believe it's in the written works section of my website. End of footnote. Now, as children gradually change teeth, and in place of the inherited teeth, they begin to show those that were formed during the first period of life, a change comes about in their life as a whole. Now they are no longer entirely sense organ, but they are given up more to a soul element than to their sensory impressions. Children of elementary school age no longer absorb what they observe in their environment. Now they take in what lives in the objects of observation. They enter a stage that should be based primarily on the principle of authority, the authority children encounter in teachers. Let's not deceive ourselves by thinking that the children between 7 and 14, whom we are educating, do not adopt the judgments we express. If we make them listen to a judgment we express in a certain phrase, we present them with something that properly belongs only to a later age. The true nature of children wants to be able to believe in us. They want to have an instinctive feeling that this is someone who can tell me something. They want to believe that teachers can inform them because they are so connected with the whole world that they can tell. Children want to see teachers as mediators between themselves and the whole universe. This is how children confront teachers, though not, of course, in so many words, but instinctively. For children, adults are the mediators between the divine world and themselves in their dependence. The only true educators are those who are aware that they must, as a matter of course, be this kind of authority. Children must be able to look up to them in a perfectly natural way. So, we have found in the course of our Waldorf school teaching and education that the question of education is principally one of teachers. How can teachers become natural authorities, mediators between the divine order of the world and children? What has the child become? From around 7 to 14 or 15, children go from being all sense organ to becoming all soul. They are not yet spirit when they place the highest value on logical connections or intellect, because this would cause an inner ossification of the soul. For children between 7 and 14, it is far more significant to tell them about something in a kind and loving way than it is to demonstrate by proof. During lessons, kind humor and congeniality are far more valuable than logic. Such children do not yet need logic. They need us and our humanity. We can say that just as children are imitators in their early years, in later years they become followers, whose souls develop according to what they can experience in soul within their psychic environment. Their sense organs have now become independent. The soul of these children has only now come into its own, and we must treat this soul with infinite tenderness. As teachers, we must become continually more intimate with what happens day by day in children's souls. Hence, in the Waldorf school, we place the greatest importance on the ability of those who teach children from 7 to 14 to give them what is appropriate for their age, with artistic love and loving art. It is essential to the education we are speaking of that teachers know the human being, and that they know what each age requires of us in teaching. What is required for the first year? What is required up to the 7th year? What is required during the elementary school period? The way we educate children up to the 10th year must be quite different, and again we must use different methods when we introduce them to human knowledge between 10 and 14. The spiritual ground of education requires that we hold in our souls a lively image of a child's nature for each year, and even each week. In this introductory talk today, I will indicate only one thing. For every child there is a critical point during the school years. There is a critical moment, roughly between the 9th and 11th years, that must not be overlooked by teachers. During this age, every normal child reaches a moment when a certain question arises. How do I find my place in the world? One must not imagine that this question arises just as I have said it. It arises as vague, unsatisfied feelings. The question reveals itself through a child's longing for dependence on an adult. It might take the form of a great love or attachment for some adult. Nevertheless, we must understand how to observe correctly what is happening in a child at this critical time. A child might suddenly feel isolated and look for something to hold on to. Until now, there was a natural acceptance of authority. Now a child begins to ask, what is this authority? Finding or not finding the right word to say at this moment will make an enormous difference to the child's whole life later on. When physicians observe childhood illnesses, it is enormously important that they look at the organism in terms of developmental processes that have significance beyond childhood, recognizing that unless they proceed correctly, the child will suffer its effects in old age. Similarly, we must understand that the ideas, sensations, or will impulses we give children must not be formed in rigid concepts that children must then learn and heed. The ideas, impulses, and sensations that we give them must be as alive as our own limbs. A child's hand is small, but it must be allowed to grow and not constrained. The ideas and soul development of children are also small and delicate, and we must not limit them with hard rules, as though such limits must be retained in the same form 30 years later, once children have grown up. The ideas we bring children must be formed so that they are able to grow. The Waldorf school is really a preparatory school. Every school should prepare children for the great school of adulthood, which is life itself. We must not learn at school for the sake of performance. Rather, we must learn at school so that we can learn further from life. This must be the ground of what we might call a spiritual, physiological pedagogy. We must have a feeling for bringing living things to children, things that can continue with them into later life. What we foster in children often lives imperceptibly in the depths of their souls, and in later life it emerges. We can use as an image, it is only an image, but it is based on a truth. There are people who at a certain time of life have a beneficial influence on others. They can, if I may use the expression, bestow blessing. Such people do not need to speak, but only need to be present with their personality, which blesses. The whole course of a life is usually not seen. Otherwise we might notice the upbringing of these people who develop the power of blessing. It may have been a conscious act by just one person, or it may have been unconscious on the part of some teacher. Such people were raised as children to be reverent, and, in the most comprehensive sense of the word, to pray, or look up to something. Thus they could exert their own will toward something. If one has first learned to honor and to be entirely surrounded by authority, then one may be able to bless and become an unquestioned authority. These things must not live merely as rules for teachers, but must become part of one's being. It must go beyond the head and be digested completely. Thus one can act through spirit and not merely think thoughts. Such things must come to life in teachers. During the next few days I will describe in detail how this can come about through each year of school, between the ages of 7 and 14. For the most part, today I wanted to explain how a certain kind of inner life, not merely a view of life, but an inner attitude, must become the ground of education. Once children have outgrown the stage of authority, having reached puberty and a very different relationship to the outer world physiologically, they also gain a very different relationship to the world in soul and body, that is, bodily life in its most comprehensive sense. This is the time when the human spirit awakens. Now, a person looks for the rational aspect and the logic in all verbal expression. Now we can hope to appeal successfully to the intellect in teaching. It is immensely important that we do not call on the intellect too early, consciously or unconsciously, as people are prone to do today. Now let's ask ourselves, what happens when we see how children accept on authority everything that guides their souls? Children do not listen to us and then verify and prove everything we say. Children take in, as an unconscious inspiration, all that works on their souls, and through the soul builds and influences the body. We cannot educate correctly unless we understand this wonderful unconscious inspiration that rules the whole life of children between 7 and 14, a time when we can work into a conscious process of inspiration. A time when we can work into a continuous process of inspiration. To do this, we must acquire still another power of spiritual cognition. We must add inspiration itself to intuition. Once we have guided children along as far as the 14th year, we make a strange discovery. They begin to find us tedious and tiring whenever we try to present them with something we have conceived logically. Initially, they will listen to our logical formulations, but if they must then rethink our logic, they eventually become weary. Also during this period, as teachers, we need something more than pure logic. We can see this from a general example. Think of a scientist such as Ernst Haeckel, who lived entirely in external nature. He was tremendously interested in all his microscopic studies and all he established. If we teach this to students, they might learn it, but they cannot develop the same interest for it. As teachers, we must develop something different from what children have in themselves. If children are coming into the realm of logic at the age of puberty, we must in turn develop imagery and imagination. Children will be able to hold on to what we give them if we can pour it all into images. Thus they receive images of the world, the activity and meaning of the world, through the pictures we create for them, as in an art form. So in this third period of life, we are directed to imagination, as in the other two toward intuition and inspiration. And now we have to look for the spiritual ground that makes it possible for us as teachers to work through imagination, inspiration, and intuition, qualities that enable one to act with spirit, not merely to think of spirit. This is what I wished to say to you by way of introduction.